Hi, everyone. I'm Elaine Quijano. It's good to be with you. Thanks for joining us. Former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin is now facing upgraded charges in the death of George Floyd. On Wednesday, Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison announced a second-degree murder charge against Chauvin. Ellison also announced that the other 3 officers at the scene will be charged with aiding and abetting second-degree murder. This comes as the Trump administration appears to be showing signs of disunity among top officials as it faces increasing scrutiny over the handling of peaceful protesters near the White House. Natalie Brand joins me now from Washington. So, Natalie, the Associated Press reports that President Trump is privately backing off threats to send troops to individual states. What more can you tell us about that?
Well, we know, Elaine, that there were some active duty troops on standby in the Washington, D.C. area. And we have some brand new reporting from our David Martin, who says a defense official tells him that a decision to start pulling the first 200 troops out of bases around Washington and then sending them back to Forts Bragg and Drum was made, but then delayed because this official tells him there's still a lot of people in the streets and still a chance for things to reverse or turn violent. And this comes as CBS News did obtain a new memo from the Department of Homeland Security that suggests some of what they're calling violent opportunists have become emboldened in recent days by some of the violent attacks that have happened in cities nationwide. And we also have learned that it's a variety of bad actors or extremist groups who appear to be infiltrating some of these demonstrations. And in talking to the peaceful demonstrators, as we've seen, there are thousands of them marching in D.C. and around the United States. They do not want those acts of violence to interfere with or overshadow their much larger, more critical message of ending police brutality, ending racial injustice. Elaine.
Natalie, I want to ask you about Defense Secretary Mark Esper. He's breaking with the president over using the Insurrection Act, and he also addressed the issue of racial inequality today. What more can you tell us about that?
Well, this was very significant, and he did take this unusual step of weighing in on the killing of George Floyd and also racial injustice, as you mentioned. I want to read you part of his quote. He said, "Racism is real in America, and we must all do our very best to recognize it, confront it, and to eradicate it." And he talked about how he's tried to do that in the United States military. So an unusual or rare move to weigh in. We know that this is a discussion happening within institutions, within the halls of Congress, within the streets and homes across America and across the world. Then he went on to talk about defending the decision of using National Guard troops to basically uphold the constitutional right to free speech and peaceful assembly, essentially protecting those peaceful protesters out there. And we've seen them standing guard at monuments around D.C., such as that striking shot of the National Guard members on the Lincoln Memorial. But then he notably splits with the president and says he would not support using the Insurrection Act to use active duty military forces in an effort to quell some of the current unrest or violent protests in cities across the United States. And as we've reported, that's something that's been used usually at the request of state and local authorities, most recently in the 1990s against the rioting in Los Angeles in response to the Rodney King beating and acquittal of those officers in that case. But it is notable because just a couple days ago, the president was threatening use of military forces and telling governors he would send them in, Elaine.
Right, and you were there at Lafayette Park when, in fact, we saw that confrontation with those peaceful demonstrators. You were in the middle of it all. Natalie Brand for us. Natalie, thank you very much.
Yes.
President Trump's insistence on the use of force to deal with protesters he claims are being marshaled by left-wing extremists is in stark contrast to his 3 predecessors. Major Garrett and Eugene Scott join me now. Major is CBS News Chief Washington Correspondent, and Eugene is a political reporter for The Washington Post. Welcome to both of you. Major, let's start with the president's threat to send in the military to get states under control. Is there a sense among administration officials and Republicans that he went too far?
Not with the administration officials, and I would say most Republicans on Capitol Hill have been willing to say the president's on to something. He hasn't done anything yet, but raising this issue and getting the attention of governors and mayors with this threat to bring in the U.S. military is probably headed in the right direction. Now, critics would say that is just yet another supine response from Republicans who can find nothing about this president that they find overtly objectionable. They would also say in their defense the president is identifying areas of lawlessness and saying the military could possibly have a role. What the White House skips over is the historical application of the Insurrection Act, always, or at least in our modern history, in concert with governors who have heard from mayors who say our existing resources are exhausted and we need federal military assistance. As Natalie Brand pointed out, that happened after the Rodney King riots in Los Angeles in 1992 and Hurricane Hugo in 1989. So when the White House says, as the press secretary did today, the president has sole and sweeping authority to send the military in, that is in itself an extravagant interpretation of the Insurrection Act and presidential power. And it skips over what has historically been the contextual backdrop of that. Governors and mayors saying, we're exhausted, things are getting out of control, and we need, in specific instances, in specific geographies, and for this specific instance, help from the federal military. What's also interesting to note here in Washington, Elaine, is you can see on social media, Federal Bureau of Prisons special riot teams have been deployed on the city streets here in Washington. These are Bureau of Prisons employees trained to suppress riots inside a federal prison. They're not trained in any way or shape or form to deal with civilians or any kind of crowd dispersal, yet they're here. It is part of a bristling, federalized, quasi-military response to what has in almost all totality been peaceful demonstrations with certain examples of wildcat violence here in the nation's capital.
Eugene, let me turn to you. You recently wrote about how President Trump is trying to defend his legacy regarding Black Americans. What narrative is he attempting to push forward?
Well, one thing the president is aware of is that large percentages of the American public, more than half, according to Yahoo News and a YouGov poll, believe that Donald Trump is racist. This is a depiction of his character that he has not been able to shake since the earliest days of his 2016 campaign, and that's put him on the defense. Many people think that the president doesn't care about this perception, but he actually does. And so he took to Twitter to tweet out some of the things he believes prove that he's not a racist, and including his support for criminal justice reform and funding for historically Black colleges and universities. But what he has done in the White House often it's quite different from the rhetoric that comes out of his mouth, or the lack of words affirming Black lives that come out of his mouth. And these are the things many Americans, and including people who are not Black, are making or paying attention to make their determination.
Well, Major, the president is facing criticism over two recent visits to houses of worship, St. John's Episcopal Church and the St. John Paul II Shrine. Do these visits help or hurt the president's relationship with his supporters?
Well, with his relationship with his supporters, particularly evangelicals and those Catholics who are on the strong conservative side of the American ideological spectrum, they probably help. And you could say the trip to the Catholic shrine on International Religious Freedom Day, you could sort of contextualize that and say, all right, that's maybe something that any president might do, but in our current context, it is clearly about increasing the visibility of Christianity within the White House as a political message and as a political multiplier, if you will. The president's support among those who believe that there is a cultural war in this country, or certainly a cultural schism that's gone on for a very long time, Rampant secularism would be one of the ways they might describe it. Find something valorous in the president walking across to St. John's Church and holding up a Bible. And just that powerful symbolic picture to them represents someone, to their mind, who is standing up for Christian principles in this country and is not afraid of being sneered at or being criticized by secularists or the left. And it's that exact divide the president loves to, and in this case, in our current context, wants to animate and draw attention to. So these are the very basic underlying political motives behind maneuvers such as that.
Eugene, I also want to ask about a piece you wrote Tuesday titled, "Why Trump's Ally of All Peaceful Protesters" line rings so hollow. Take us through that.
In President Trump's first response beyond Twitter to the death of George Floyd in a formal speech, he sought to defend accusations that he was criticizing peaceful protesters. And he called himself an ally of all peaceful protesters. But anyone who remembers Donald Trump of the 2016 campaign, or even before, knows that the president was a vocal critic, should I say, of Black Lives Matter activists, even going so far as to suggest that if one of his rallies was interrupted by them, that he would perhaps get into a fight with them himself. We also know that he called for the firing and even suggested that NFL players who protest peacefully racism and police violence during the national anthem should be kicked out of the country, and used profane language to describe them as well. Some of his words for Women's March individuals and other Americans protesting his policies, his worldview, and his administration show that he is not an ally of peaceful protesters, and in fact has sometimes been an ally of violent protesters, such as protesters in Charlottesville, who he called very fine people, and some protesters during the Open Up movement, who we know got in the faces of police officers and yelled during the coronavirus pandemic, and even got in a bit of a tussle with some.
Well, Major, every former living president has now issued a statement on the death of George Floyd and acknowledged inherent problems in the justice system. How significant is that?
I think it's very significant. It's because we have reached this moment of not just recognizing an injustice in a particular case, but piecing it together as advocates for criminal justice reform and those who have talked about institutional racism have asked our country to do for decades. Much of the country is now hearing that message in an entirely different way and saying, you know, it's not just about this incident or that incident, this name, that location, this particular officer, this particular municipality. Perhaps it's part of a larger structure. And that is a very new conversation in our country, embryonic to be sure. But when you have every former living president in their own words, in their own ways, saying, yes, this is an institutional problem. This is a legacy that our entire country has, and our indifference to it is part of their presidencies, but they don't want it to be a part any longer of their post-presidencies. It is, in its own way, a message of accountability and a message about what they failed to accomplish while they were president, or maybe, in their own words and for lack of actions, failed to recognize in the totality we're beginning to recognize and talk about as a country.
Well, Eugene, President Obama has not offered much criticism of the Trump administration until just recently. What has changed here?
I think a sense of urgency. I think the former president realizes that there is a very good chance that President Trump will win re-election. And in addition to completely dismantling the Obama legacy, or at least the workings of the administration, the former president risks just seeing the country go in a direction that is quite different from what he believes actually makes America great. And so he really wants to mobilize voters, and not just the left, but voters in the center, or even voters on the right who perhaps are very disappointed with the leadership coming out of the White House to back this current president. We are seeing approaches to issues that concern Americans, be it an economic downturn, a pandemic, or police violence, get a response from the White House that's quite different from anything that we've seen in the past. And President Obama, former President Obama, certainly wants people to know that this can be stopped and it doesn't have to continue.
All right, Major Garrett and Eugene Scott, thanks to you both.
Of course.